Well, it's 2 o'clock. I suspect it may be time for us to begin. Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. It's funny, in today's very strange times, even to say good afternoon is almost the expression of a prayer. Nothing is normal, nothing is usual, and the world seems upside down. But we are approaching and we are excited about a very, very meaningful, important, and relevant conversation that we're going to be having this afternoon. The topic title says it all: the social and health impacts of mass incarceration in America. So we welcome you to this opportunity for us to share with you on this topic. I thought I'd start with a little definition as I do a brief introduction here. Institutional racism, also known as systemic racism, is a form of racism that is embedded as normal practice within society or an organization. It can lead to such issues as discrimination in criminal justice, that'll be important for today, employment, housing, health care, that will also be important today, political power, banking, and education, among other issues. Today, of course, the focus is going to be mass incarceration. Some have said that mass incarceration refers to the unique way the United States has locked up a vast population in federal and state prisons, as well as local jails. Now, recall what I just said about institutional or systemic racism. These prisoners are disproportionately Black and Latino, against whom the system is biased at every level. What I just read on mass incarceration comes from a publication or an article by Daniel Knott, N-O-T-T, What is Mass Incarceration? So today, as we address ourselves to this very, very special and important topic, we have two outstanding experts on the criminal justice system and the healthcare system, and in this case, the intersection of those two. Now, before I introduce them, although I think if you're looking, you can probably see them, a very handsome couple. I want to first tell you how we're going to go about this. After a period of discussion, we will then be addressing questions that you will be presenting, and we'd ask you to present them in this format. Hopefully at the bottom of your screen, but someplace on this Zoom production, you should see a chat button or a chat window. It's a little speaker thing with 3 dots in it. If you go to the chat area and put your question down, we will be able to see it. We will read it so everybody will know what your question is, and we will invite our panelists to address themselves to that question. We'd like to ask you to present the questions at any time that you like, but we intend to answer them at the end. So that's the way we're going to go forward. So these two distinguished panelists are Dr. David Carlisle and Aimee Carlisle. And yes, they are related. Dr. Carlisle has been President and Chief Executive Officer of Charles R. Drew University of Medicine and Science in the Watts-Willowbrook area of Los Angeles County since 2011. He's a published author in health policy, quality of care, medical education diversity, and eliminating health disparities. He's board certified in internal medicine, a specialist in that. President Carlisle received his BA from Wesleyan University, his medical degree doctorate from Brown University, and his MPH and PhD in health services from the UCLA Fielding School of Public Health. President Carlisle served as director of the Office of Statewide Health Planning and Development for 11 years under 3 governors. Under his leadership, OSHPD released its first ever health disparities report and increase scholarship and loan repayment opportunities for health providers committed to practice in underrepresented, under-resourced, and underserved communities. In 2018, he was appointed as a member of the California Future Health Workforce Commission to help the state develop a plan to close the gap between the health workforce we have and the workforce we need. That year, he was also appointed to the Board of Trustees for the California Healthcare Foundation. Now, those of us who are part of the CDU family know that from the time he became president and chief executive officer here, he has begun to trailblaze in the same way with us. And I think his resume from here on, looking back to when he started, is going to be equally as long, perhaps more so, and equally as impressive. So we really thank you, Dr. Carlisle, for what you're going to add to this conversation we're going to have. Aimee is his daughter. Aimee is a senior attorney. She'll tell you about that. She has been an attorney, but she's a senior attorney now in the criminal defense practice at the Bronx Defenders, a holistic public defense nonprofit organization in the Bronx, New York State, of course. At the Bronx Defenders, Aimee has represented hundreds of people accused of crimes throughout all stages of their cases at the trial level. Aimee received her Juris Doctor from New York University School of Law, where she received the Root Tilden Kern Public Interest Scholarship and the Derek Bell Scholarship for Public Service. She also served on the board of the Black Allied Law Students Association. Aimee received a BA in Spanish and Linguistics with highest honors and minors in Japanese and Middle East South Asia Studies from the University of California at Davis. When we have time, I'd just love to find out how she put those two things together, Spanish and Japanese. For her, that is something that makes her quite literate. So let's go into this. We're going to engage in a discussion now on mass incarceration. I think if I could, I'd like to start with Attorney Carlisle. So the way we're going to do this, when I refer to Attorney Carlisle, I want the doctor in law. When I refer to Dr. Carlisle, I want the doctor in medicine. Attorney Carlisle, please tell us about the Bronx Defenders and your work with them.
Thank you all for having me. I'll also just say very briefly, thank you for supporting my dad as president. I know he loves being president at Charles Drew, and I love that he's so happy with his work. The Bronx Defenders is a holistic public defense nonprofit in New York City. We represent people particularly charged with crimes in New York City and the Bronx specifically, but we provide a whole host of other types of legal representation. At the Bronx Defenders, we pioneered a model of holistic public defense, and what that means is that we recognize that the criminal legal system is not the only system that is working to marginalize people. And so we provide immigration defense attorneys, we provide family defense attorneys, we represent people in housing court because we recognize that the arrest is not the only part of the system itself that actively works against our clients. And so we try to really serve their needs in many different areas. We're also what we call a vertical office, which means that we represent people at every single stage of the criminal case. Some public defense have trial attorneys and arraignment attorneys, and what we've seen is that it's much better for our clients for them to have one attorney who represents them from the beginning through the end of the case. Yes, I recently did get a promotion, so I am now a senior attorney. I work in our legal department, and what that means is that I'm still lead counsel on my own caseload, but I'm also helping our criminal defense attorneys with their own legal practice. So we
lost you. Cannot hear.
No, I think she froze.
Yeah, I think we lost her.
Let me go see if I can find out what we can do about that.
Yeah.
Is everyone else still out there?
I think they are back now.
Okay. Well, how do I get them back?
They are back, but Mr. President, we can't hear you yet.
Yes, apologies.
Okay, all right.
I know that if our CIO is watching, he probably just had a minor heart attack. And in contrast to the State of the University address, I'm Wi-Fiing it right now. I was hardwired connected into the Ethernet internet yesterday. So that's technology in the world of COVID-19. We are back.
Well, that was exciting. I'll take a chance on you, Attorney Carlisle. I want to ask you another question. Dismantling structures of racial disparity in the criminal justice system is an ongoing call to action. What to you does dismantling entail as a criminal defense attorney working on behalf of the disenfranchised?
I don't think that there's any way that this system can be reformed, because I believe, based on everything that I've seen, that it's working exactly as it is intended. I think the only way to really understand these stark racial disparities on both ends of the system is to recognize that the purpose of the system is to promote white supremacy and a narrative of racial difference. And when I say that, I mean that Black lives, lives of people of color, the lives of people with disabilities, the lives of immigrants, basically anybody who is marginalized in society, their lives are not treated with any kind of value, whether they are accused of committing crimes or whether they're victims of crimes. And so I think that if we want to have a system that actually promotes justice, that promotes equity, that promotes rehabilitation, we have to really imagine and reimagine as a community and a society what that system can look like. And I just don't think that it's kind of possible to create that system within the confines of the criminal legal system as it exists today.
If I may, Council Patton, I'll just append on to that kind of a real world scenario that I experienced. So Aimee has been staying with us this summer from New York City. And she's been working all summer. Walking by her room one day with the door closed, I heard the most intense screaming going on. It was so overwhelming. It sounded like the type of screaming you'd hear from a Hollywood 1950s B-movie horror movie, basically. And so I kind of cautiously went into Aimee's room. I thought I might see something fictional on a computer screen or something, but no. And I saw a courtroom, and so I walked back out. And later on, I asked Aimee, "What was the screaming?" And she said, "Well, that was a client of theirs, not hers, who had just found out for a relatively minor crime what her bail amount was going to be. And for this woman, obviously a woman of color, this bail amount was such a significant amount, although not by any means overwhelming, but for her it was overwhelming. She couldn't make bail. And when she couldn't make bail, off she goes to jail for weeks and weeks, away from her family, away from her children, away from her loved ones, away from her job, because she doesn't have the money for bail. Now, if you are in the upper, 50% or whatever of the income distribution in the United States, that is not an issue for you. But if you are low income and you're faced with cash bail from the criminal justice system for a relatively minor offense, a lot of people in jail today simply cannot pay bail, and their lives just go downhill from that point. It was devastating listening to the emotionality that day.
And I would just add, since I know the specific case my dad is referring to, that in that case, the defense attorney explained as part of their application for their client's relief many details of the facts of the case, and explained that their client was actually the victim of the crime here, that they had been robbed multiple times. Now that the person who had victimized them was kind of creating this false narrative of what happened, and that even those facts weren't enough to get released. And that person, I believe the bail amount was only set at $2,500. And again, as my dad described, it still had a very significant impact, because as the person was screaming in court, they didn't even have the money to come up with that. There are people, particularly where I practice, who for a very long time would sit in jail on $500 bail, right? $500 cash. They couldn't even come up with that amount to secure their freedom, or even more, even, you know, $1,000. They would only need to come up with $100 if they could get to a bail bonds company, and just didn't have the financial resources to even get that amount of money together. So as my dad's saying, we essentially have a two-tiered system of justice here, and people who have money are able to enjoy their actual presumption of innocence. They're able to walk out of court, come back to court, continue working, you know, stay with their kids. But if you don't have money, the situation is very dire, and it becomes very dire within hours of being arrested. I've met clients, you know, 24 hours is usually around the time when I meet them, after they've been in custody for 24 hours, and they're sobbing because, you know, they're parents and they don't know where their kids are. And I can't tell them where their kids are. They're distraught because they just got a job, and if they don't make it to their work site in an hour or two, they're going to lose the job. And there are very, very significant consequences for people that happen very immediately, that you really only face if you're a person of color or if you're poor.
So as we go on, I thank you for that, Aimee. Of course, the fascinating thing is this is a traumatic individual case, and you multiply that out across a population, and you have mass incarceration. You're incarcerated before you're convicted. You're incarcerated for reasons that aren't equally applied to other people. The conviction rate isn't going to be the same as for other people. And now you find yourself joining a very large and disproportionately minority population of people who have been convicted and are now in the criminal justice system, I guess, for keeps. Dr. Carlisle, let me ask you this, because let's see about this. This whole business about racism and systemic racism, the intersection of all these different parts is what's preying upon the people. So, Dr. Carlisle, what public health intersections can you draw between dismantling racial inequalities in healthcare and addressing the inequalities in the judicial system that your daughter just talked about?
Well, when you think of things from a population medicine standpoint or public health perspective, consider this. We often use the metric years of productive life lost when we talk about disease. Think about the years of productive life lost due to mass incarceration. That by itself is a significant public health issue for the African American community. When you go to prison for 30 years because of crack cocaine, when somebody else is going to prison for 3 years for the same amount of powder cocaine, that is 27 years of additional productive life lost. That is disproportionately impacting the African American community. When you think about back in 1970, roughly 300,000 Americans were incarcerated. Fast forward to the year 1990, that number is 3 million Americans. That is a public health issue because those people are losing years of life because they're incarcerated, often for relatively minor offenses. When you think about the fact that the United States has 5% of the world's population, and I hope everyone's sitting down, 25% of the world's incarcerated population, That is a public health issue because those people are losing years of productive life.
Wow, that's very sobering. Back to you, Attorney Carlisle. A known fact is that people of color are incarcerated at a rate, now we're going to look at the rate, higher than their demographic. I think your dad was just kind of alluding to this. For instance, Blacks represent 33% of the sentenced population. Hispanics account for 23% of inmates. We have that from the Pew Research documentation. Hispanics account for 23%. As concerning, the Department of Justice reports that an alarming 67% of released prisoners are rearrested within 3 years. So once again, it's something that you can't ever seem to evade or escape. So here's my question. With such a high rate of rearrest, how do we focus on mass incarceration as a problem when one can argue these are criminals that cycle in and out of prison? Self-fulfilling prophecy as far as labeling is concerned. What's your view about that? Somebody may say, well, it's recidivism, but it's because they've offended.
There's so many different ways to answer that question. I think it's particularly interesting to think about it in the space that we're in here, which is a healthcare space. Because I think the reality is that when people are arrested and are rearrested, they are responding to situations in a way that any human being would. The big issue is that once people are branded as felons or criminals or whatever it is, they are almost completely barred from any kind of resources that would enable them to actually serve society. So someone with a felony conviction is almost completely unemployable. Depending on the felony conviction, when it happened, they might not be eligible for federal student aid, so they can't easily go to college. We're seeing right now that a number of inmates are actually the primary firefighters here in California, and so many people are able to fight fires and to save our people when they're incarcerated, but as soon as they get out, they can't apply to become an actual firefighter because of their conviction. So I think when people have no other opportunities, when there's no other way for them to actually feed and take care of their families, the unfortunate reality is that they are just more likely to be arrested again. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to actually commit additional crimes, but it means, first of all, that they're going to be more likely to live in over-policed communities. And I think what we've seen, particularly in a number of protests this summer and in recent years, is that for some institutions, right, when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And so if you responders who aren't actually trained to or don't choose to use the training that they have to de-escalate situations, then things just become more complicated. I think the biggest thing is definitely that's causing recidivism is the lack of employment. And I remember when I was in law school and I was in a criminal defense and reentry clinic, one of the facts that stuck with me was how creating jobs programs in communities and actually increasing employment really decreased the rate of recidivism, or the rate at which people committed crimes again. And it is incredibly difficult to do that when we're kind of in the first instance already operating in a system that doesn't value the lives of the people who are caught up in it. I remember within the past year, I had a client who was a teenager. He wasn't even 20 yet, had completed a drug program. And I was explaining to the judge, you know, he had a little bit more to do. And the judge just told me, you know, I don't care if he gets a criminal record. And at that point, you know, I can only do so much. My client can only do so much. He completed a drug program. He got his GED. But if the actors who have the most control over the results aren't invested in his ability to actually be a productive member of society, then it's going to be much more difficult for anyone who's caught up in the system to be able to do it on their own.
Thank you for that. Again, we're beginning to get some of the questions that are coming in the chat. That's how you would present your question to the panel. Write it out and put it in chat. and we will get to that in the time that we have left. This is to both of you now. Mass incarceration. We want to expand our thinking now to the immigration front, where it seems like the similar disproportionate outcomes are part of a different system here, or maybe just part of the same system. Mass incarceration has been termed the new Jim Crow because of its social and racial inequities. Would you please speak to how the United States immigration enforcement is also a Jim Crow system for migrants related to our justice, our judicial, and our healthcare systems? Do you see a parallel structure going on with the immigration system in America?
Well, one thing that I will say is just look at the pronouncements that are emanating out of Washington about immigrants, Mexican Americans, rapists, murderers, criminals, immigrants, criminals. MS-13, you vote for Joe Biden, and MS-13 is going to be next door. Yes, the specter of immigration from a certain political perspective is all about the criminalization of immigrants. And of course, if we know anything about the history of immigration in the United States, that is not true. In fact, when you actually look at data, immigrants are less likely to commit crimes than non-immigrant populations. And I mean, if you want to get right down to it, we'll say Mexican American immigrants are much less likely to commit crimes in the United States than Mexican Americans who are non-immigrants in the United States. That's the bottom line here.
I'll just add too that there are very, very direct links between the criminal legal system and the immigration legal system. That is why I started off by saying that my office provides immigration attorneys. People who are not U.S. citizens have a constitutional right to effective counsel and effective advice regarding immigration consequences, and generally criminal defense attorneys are not trained to provide that kind of guidance. There are frequently, I think this happened even last month in New York, convictions that are overturned because criminal defense attorneys failed to provide adequate legal counsel regarding immigration consequences. And this matters because in the United States, and I don't think this is something that people talk about a lot when they talk about mass incarceration, but there are 400,000 people every single year who are detained in immigration proceedings. And the real tragedy, right, is that this includes, because parents and people are detained, it results in the separation of but also there's no constitutional right. Adults, many people are being deported without ever having an attorney look at their case, look to see if they can make an asylum claim, look to see if they have any kind of relief from deportation. And many times they will be detained that whole time. And immigration jails are more likely to be for-profit institutions as well, which again creates a very perverse incentive to detain people as they're awaiting the results in their immigration proceedings. So they're absolutely related.
Thank you for that. Another question to both of you. Again, we're trying to get a holistic handle on this thing. The fundamental question I'm going to be asking now is, do people who are incarcerated, they may not even be convicted, do they have any fundamental right to health care? So here's the way I'm going to word the question. How would you evaluate the level of attention public agencies give to the health and health care of the incarcerated? Should they be subjected to poor or non-existent health care because they're incarcerated?
Well, I would have to say, in answering that question, that there are a lot of people who would say the answer is yes, who believe that if you are incarcerated, and especially if you have a history of incarceration and conviction, that you don't deserve excellent health care. I certainly don't feel that way. But I know that there are people who have that sentiment. I would say that if you are incarcerated, your ability to get mainstream, let alone excellent health care, is impaired, is challenged. We know that we have people who are providing health care in prison systems. There is health care, and there's a expectation and a right to health care. But I think it would be honest to say that it's probably not the type of health care that anyone about us would consider to be normative health care. And if you need high technology health care, you're probably not going to get that in the prison system. You're going to be transferred to a high technology center, a tertiary or quaternary care center to get your health care.
And I'll just add that, echoing everything my dad has said, but I think we know that particularly for people with mental illness, there's just, our system over incarcerates them. Over 50% of the people in custody right now have a diagnosed mental illness. What we've seen, especially in the COVID-19 era, is that our jails and prisons are not able to provide adequate care. And so when I was in New York City earlier this year, Rikers Island, the main city jail, was the epicenter of the epicenter, which was New York City. And so we saw my office and a number of all the public defenders in the city filed a lawsuit against the city, and the correctional officers ended up joining our lawsuit because there wasn't adequate PPE in the jails. And so people were literally just contracting COVID-19 from one another. A lot of people have died. A lot of people contracted the disease because our jails aren't able to provide adequate health care. And they don't kind of normally anyways.
Obviously, there's a stigma in many people's minds attached with simply coming into contact with the criminal justice system. We people of color know how easy it is to get in contact with the system. The system is looking for you, and the system is not looking at you like it looks at other people. But once that happens, we become stigmatized in many people's minds. So I want to ask you about myths around mass incarceration. Attorney Carlisle, what do you think are some of the myths that are associated with this? I suppose one of them is that there's no such thing as mass incarceration, but why don't you tell me what you think they are?
Well, I think there are going to be so many answers, but I think unfortunately, right, that the myths that people who have no exposure to the criminal legal system kind of hold are very different from what people and communities who have this contact on a regular basis know. So, there's this idea, right? There's this language about black on black crime, but that term in itself is a complete misnomer, because what we've seen from the data is that every single race of person is more likely to commit crimes against members of their own race, because overwhelmingly when we're talking about trends, people commit crimes against people that are close to them. But we only have a term of black on black crime to create this idea that Black people are in some ways deviant or abnormal, and it just doesn't reflect the reality. 85% of white people who are victims of violent crime were the victims of another white person. Something else that I think about a lot, and I think is very apparent in my practice, but I think is also pervasive in the system at large, is I think that there's this belief that victims and perpetrators are different people. And what I've seen in my own work, right, is that victims and so-called perpetrators come from the same communities. They come from the same experiences. We're just meeting them at different moments of their lives. And this is, if you've read Just Mercy, Brian Stevenson's book, or seen his work, you can see that. And it's something that I've seen in my own practice, right, is that my clients have survived very significant levels of trauma, whether it's just the trauma of living in, the poorest part of this country, or actual abuse. And I think it's very challenging for us to explain that sometimes as prosecutors. I'll just give you a quick anecdote, but one of my friends was representing a woman who was pregnant, and the prosecutor was only offering her a prison plea for drug charges. And my friend explained to her that her client had been through a lot. She actually had her first pregnancy when she was 11 years old. And the prosecutor said, maybe it was consensual. We don't know, that it wasn't something that she wanted. We were just trying to explain to a prosecutor that there's no way that an 11-year-old could have consented to anything like that. The prosecutor wasn't swayed, didn't see our client as a victim, and going to prison for a very long time and having her child in custody. So I think that's one of the myths. I would just say something else that I reflect on a lot is, I don't know that I would call this a myth, but maybe a misconception, is that I think people believe that they don't have as much power in this system as they actually do when it comes to jury service in particular. And it's very disheartening for me, I think, how so many people can be so cavalier about jury service. You have to be a US citizen to be a juror, but you don't have to be a citizen to be convicted and sent to prison and deported. And it's very disheartening to me when people, try to get out of jury service or don't take it very seriously, because literally other people's lives are on the line. There are people who can sit in jail for a year or two waiting for a jury trial. And sometimes people don't take that responsibility seriously. And in this country, it's a right that a lot of our ancestors have died for. Black people weren't originally allowed to be on juries. Anyone who wasn't white or a man wasn't allowed to be on a jury. So that's something that I think that we need to have more awareness about, is the impact of jury service and how important it is.
If I could also address that question, Mr. Patton, let me say to everyone, if you haven't seen the movie 13th, you need to see it. It's all about mass incarceration. And one of the big myths, I think one of the big disparities that exists in this country, is that most Black people that I know that the criminal justice system is stacked against them. And it's been that way for decades and decades and decades. Most white people that I know don't view the system as intrinsically unfair. I was driving through Northern California, way up in the rural areas, actually going by a state prison one day. And I turned to the gentleman who was in the car with me, a white government official, and I used the term the prison industrial complex. And this is a highly informed individual in a very significant policy-making position. And he said, prison industrial complex? What's that? I've never heard that term. And I said, what? You've never heard that term? And he said, no. And I said, it refers to the for-profit incarceration industry in the United States. And if you want to see that industry at work, all you have to do is look at the movie, The 13th. And you'll see this goes all the way back to the post-Reconstruction era, when people were imprisoned and placed on chain gangs to work because they couldn't pay a debt. That was the beginning of the prison industrial complex. Of course, before that, it was called slavery.
Yes, and just to add, the 13th Amendment, what my dad is referring to, and the premise of the movie, right? The 13th Amendment outlaws slavery in the United States, except as punishment for a crime. And so what we've seen now, right, is we essentially have legalized slavery so long as it's preceded by a conviction.
John, did we lose you?
What you did there, Aimee, was so fascinating. That seems like an institutional bait and switch. They're not saying that you're incarcerated that you're going to be enslaved because of your color. What they're doing now is finding a way to incarcerate you and convict you, and they get the same place. That is to say, disproportionately, because of your color, you're a convict now, and all of a sudden you're in the same status as if you were a slave. We're almost out of time, but Dr. Carlisle, I've got another question I think I really need to ask you, because the university, Charles R. Drew University, is in a unique position to be part of the solution here. So I'd like you to address yourself, if you could, to this question. We don't hear from healthcare providers regarding the attention given to the incarcerated. This appears to be a population erased from medical education and research. This is, of course, broadly speaking. I'd like you to comment, Dr. Carlisle, on the significance of this observation.
Well, I really think it's true. There's a whole difference in orientation toward incarcerated and post-incarcerated populations, pretty much depending on where you're from. In people who are from city, urban, under-resourced community populations, know about this revolving door of incarceration that impacts 1/3 or more of African American men, 40, 50% even. And so they know basically how real incarceration is, and how important it is to basically consider the welfare of individuals who are and have been incarcerated. Because we might be talking about one of our relatives. I mean, it comes down to our cousin, uncle, brother, somebody like that. Those lives are important to us. I would say that if you're a dermatologist practicing boutique medicine in Bel Air, you could care less about the incarcerated population. There's really nothing exotic about taking care of incarcerated individuals. You're not going to get wealthy taking care of individuals who are incarcerated. Doctors who do it because care, and they have empathy. The doctors who don't do it could care less. And we need more people, healthcare professionals of every type, who want to prioritize that population because that population is important to them. Yes, I totally agree. This is a major gap in medical education. We'd rather talk about performing, right brain transplantation than we'd be talking about making sure that somebody who's serving a life sentence is getting adequate care for COVID-19. And that is a fundamental problem with the American healthcare system.
And I think the two of you actually are part of a team that should be addressing this on both ends. First of all, I question so many people with life sentences, whether they actually got justice. But the further punishment is that they are being systemically dehumanized. And it's an interesting flip for the United States. We started off not being people, and it seems like somebody's determined to make sure we end up not being people. Let me ask one more question. We have several questions that I want to address with the audience. I thank you all for putting those in. But following up on what you said, Dr. Carlisle, what can healthcare providers do to align their work with an effort to end mass incarceration?
Well, one thing that I would say is healthcare providers of every type are opinion leaders. And we need to consolidate our opinions to basically say, this is not a situation that is tolerable. We cannot have people losing their lives because of some trivial criminal conviction. I say losing their lives, I don't mean literally, but being incarcerated for decades. We remember just recently the gentleman in Louisiana whose case went all the way to the Louisiana Supreme Court, where every judge on the Supreme Court voted to perpetuate his conviction and his life sentence for stealing gardening. They said he was a habitual criminal. He's serving a life sentence for stealing gardening shears. The only justice on the Louisiana Supreme Court who voted against that heinous sentence was the only African American and the only woman on the Louisiana Supreme Court. What does that tell you about the humanity of this system when somebody can be put away for life for the crime of stealing gardening shears? Where, except in the United States maybe, is that kind of reality even able to be contemplated? It is unjust and inhumane. And we need to work as healthcare providers to say, from a public health perspective, this is a travesty. We need to work against it. We need to know that healthcare does not simply stop with the ability to see somebody in your office with high blood pressure. You've got to worry about that community that can't come in to see you because they're incarcerated disproportionately for something like stealing gardening shears.
I would add two things. I think one of the great things about Charles Drew University is that you are committed to creating healthcare professionals who go and serve in these under-resourced communities. So I think having doctors, nurses, PAs, healthcare professionals who see people as people and are really committed to value that their lives matter is essential to rehumanizing people in the communities that we're talking about and over-policed. I'll also just add as a second point that particularly for healthcare professionals and researchers, do the research that is going to help us. So many of the kind of reforms or good improvements in the criminal legal system that have happened, such as, you know, reducing penalties for children or people who committed crimes as children, misidentification, research has all been done by healthcare professionals who did the work to show that, for example, you know, the human brain isn't fully developed at 20 or 21, or to show how, from a scientific standpoint, cross-racial identifications are so prone to error. In fact, misidentification is the leading cause of wrongful convictions. And so it's when we have scientific evidence to back up our arguments in court that we can actually be very effective as trial attorneys and as appellate attorneys doing this work. So there is certainly more research that we need. And then obviously reaching out, supporting your public defenders so that we can bring that evidence to the courtroom on behalf of our clients.
Well, you all are probably pretty prescient, I think, what your father said about the lone Louisiana justice who was the African American who voted differently than everybody else. And now you're talking about what you can do with the evidence that's presented to you as a public defender. Listen to this first question we got from the audience. Given what Attorney Carlisle said, that the system is working as it is designed to work, why are the Black and brown state attorneys perpetuating a system designed against their own people, including Black and brown judges? Aren't they part of the problems? What's your response? What are you doing in that system, Aimee? How are you addressing from the inside of this system the inequities of the system?
I think this is something that public defenders in particular struggle with internally a lot is, are we becoming complicit in the system by even being present, right? The system wouldn't be able to move if we didn't exist. And so I think a lot of us struggle with that internally. My perspective is that I believe that I'm committed to doing the absolute best job that I can for my clients and to really humanizing them. And that means standing beside someone, right, as they can sometimes be, as they're listening sometimes to very horrible things being said about them, and letting them know that they're not alone and that I'll be with them through that process. As far as prosecutors and judges, I'm not one of those, so I can't tell you so much about their motivations. But I think that's why we talk about this as a systemic issue, because I remember when I was in law school, you know, there weren't a lot of people that were interested in becoming prosecutors where I went to school, but some of them did talk about, you know, prosecutorial discretion and how they wanted to do things differently. But the reality is that a lot of line prosecutors, the people who are actually, you know, handling the cases, don't have the discretion that they're kind of taught to believe that they would have. So I think that's why we're talking about systemic change, because it's so big and so pervasive that it's not something that individuals can actually undo on their own.
I'll add, if I may, it's not every country where you're guaranteed a right to an attorney, but that's certainly the case in the United States. And so those attorneys that you're guaranteed a right to are the public defenders. They're often the only person standing between somebody who's charged with a crime and being convicted of a crime. And I'll tell a story. I think some of you know that my son is also a public defender up in Oakland. And one of his cases involves somebody who was driving a truck and where the truck rear-ended a car under circumstances in Oakland, and the driver of the car was killed. This is a truck driver with no other criminal record. And the prosecutors basically said, well, of course he was driving improperly. He rear-ended this car. Of course it's manslaughter. Of course he deserves to go to prison. But that's not always the case. And it was, profound when my son was able to convince the jury that the driver was doing everything proper, no reports of improper driving prior to the accident. The only thing that happened was he was getting ready to exit the freeway, looked to his right, went straight back ahead, probably less than a second. And in that less than a second, the traffic in front of him had stopped. And if you know Oakland freeways, you know how that can happen. And there was nothing he could do. He wasn't impaired, he wasn't drunk, he wasn't careless. This gentleman was facing years and years in prison because the prosecutor was trying to convince the judge, of course, he was driving improperly. It was the public defender who convinced the jury, yes, the driver was doing everything proper and could not have prevented this accident from occurring. That's what a public defender does. This man is free today because of the role of public defenders.
Thank you for that. That's a great example. I don't think we're asking for special treatment. I think we're asking for what everybody else has. Where is our presumption of innocence? If it's a waste of time to take me to trial, then what is this all for? Let me ask this next question. Thank you, sir. Given that state and local governments and the courts are entrenched in maintaining a status quo structure friendly to the bail bond industry, are there charities dedicated to assisting people who need funds for bail? Attorney Carlisle, I guess that may be your call there. What happens to a person? Is there debtor's prison in America? People who don't have money can't get justice?
There absolutely is debtor's prison, even though it's not permitted under our law. There are plenty of people who are incarcerated in jail because they can't either pay bail or they can't pay fines and fees that they get, after some kind of traffic infraction or something like that. As far as bail funds, yes, they do exist. The first one that I'm aware of was created in the Bronx Freedom Fund. If you just Google Freedom Fund in whatever jurisdiction or locality you're looking at, they'll pop up. But yes, there are nonprofit organizations that do try to pay bail as they're able to. Some states have statutes that limit their ability to function.
I just want to say, California just passed a law dismantling the cash bail system in the state of California. I believe, I don't know, Mr. Patton, if we learned about this further, but I believe there may be a ballot measure on the November ballot to restore the cash bail system in California. The difference is incarceration, no incarceration prior to trial for people that cannot put up the cash for their bail. This is a fundamental issue, especially for the African American community, especially for Latino community, especially for peoples of color in the state of California.
I'll just say too, a little bit broader, the problem is pre-trial detention. Cash bail and requiring money for people to get their freedom when they're still legally innocent is part of the problem. But a bigger part of the problem is pre-trial detention, which says that people can be held in jail regardless of money, as long as they've been accused of a crime. And we've seen how detrimental that can be. I'm sure you all are familiar with Khalif Browder, who spent years in jail before charges against him were ultimately dismissed. He was originally held in on bail he couldn't make, and then he continued to be in custody because he got parole from a prior conviction. And he was innocent. He hadn't committed the crime that he was charged with. The prosecution knew that. They dragged it out, ultimately was released. But the trauma that he experienced while he was at Rikers, literally being abused by guards, by inmates, for so many years, caused a significant mental health breakdown, and soon after he was released, he ended up committing suicide. So it's an exercise in cognitive dissonance to say that you're presumed innocent. You're innocent until and unless you get convicted, but we're going to hold some of you in jail based on an accusation, and that's a system that disproportionately impacts us.
And how old was Keith when he was first arrested?
Khalif was very young. In that case, I think he was in his early 20s.
So where does he go to get his life back? I guess he took his life. Well, we're going to run out of time to answer all these questions, but they're such good questions. I wonder if I could propose, take a chance here. Maybe we can answer these questions and provide the answers later because they're very good questions. This next question is exactly where you are, Aimee, exactly where you were, Dr. Carlisle. The emotional challenges, the psychic and the psychological damage. The other part of this healthcare conundrum here is even if you manage to get out with your life, they've taken something from you that nobody can give back to you. Your marriage is possibly destroyed. Your reputation in the community is possibly destroyed. You don't have a job anymore. But we made a mistake. It wasn't you. You're on your way. Good luck. How do you manage the emotional challenges of confronting judges and other players within the system, that includes you, Aimee, that continue to sustain and perpetuate the injustice within the system? If I understand the tenor of the question, fighting against this beast takes a toll out of everybody. And how do we manage that part of this? Both of you can answer it, I suppose, because it's part and parcel of the system itself. They can't give you back what they took from you, but it's not always easy to get it back. What's going to happen? Where do you go after that? How do you get your mind back?
I mean, I think for many people in many communities, they don't. And so we have a real epidemic trauma in communities that are incarcerated, that are incarcerated to begin with. I frankly can't tell you how my clients sometimes get the strength to keep going. I've met clients who weren't able to keep going. I've had some of these conversations with people who are struggling because they were in custody, because they had been in custody before. There's long-term mental illness that comes from being in custody. I've had clients with PTSD that they first developed when they were in jail. And I think any healthcare provider, like you all know, about the impact of vicarious trauma. And for us, people who are trying to serve our clients, that yes, we do also struggle sometimes with being in the system and fighting a battle that it's designed for us to lose, and we lose so often. So, I mean, everybody has their own strategies for doing this work. I like to hang out with my family. They make me feel happy, and they bring me a lot of joy, and they bring me a lot of support too. So.
Well, we're kind of out of time, but you know, as you were talking, Aimee, I couldn't help but think about the guy who got shot 7 times in the back. The more I find out about that story, the more outraged and frustrated I am, and all the victims. He shot 7 times in the back. He didn't die. What a tenacious person holding his life, but he's possibly paralyzed. But I'm looking at it from the standpoint of the children. His 3 children saw that. One of them is the birthday boy that he was trying to buy a present for. And every year when this man's child has a birthday, what he's going to be remembering is what happened to his dad. Well, I guess it's time for me to thank you both of you for all that you've done here. That has been a wonderful unpeeling of all the different layers of this problem that we're dealing with mass incarceration. I guess in summation, because we only have 2 minutes, I would remind myself of the things that each of you has said. Attorney Carlisle, you said this, essentially, the criminal justice system is not broken. It is working just as it has been designed and it is intended to work. So the system is actually working. Dr. Carlisle, you said this, years of productive life are lost. When the system is working as it's designed to work, it's taking the productive life from people unjustly, and that is a public health issue. I want to thank the 2 of you for being so helpful to us in understanding this aspect of systemic racism in America. And I think that you have given us a new charge and given the university a new objective to strike a blow for justice in this area, as well as in the ordinary healthcare things that we are doing. I want to thank you for that. I want to thank everybody who participated by watching. It seems like we have to do this again. We kind of ran out of time before we ran out of topics. So thank you so much. Everybody enjoy the rest of your day as much as you can. Be safe, and we'll see you around the bend. Bye-bye.